Officially, the 2021 Belgian Grand Prix is the shortest Grand Prix ever run at just 3 minutes and 27 seconds. However, I would dispute this fact. If you look literally at any definition of the phrase Grand Prix in the motor racing sense, you will find that they explicitly mention, well, racing. And I'm sorry, statisticians, but slowly driving 2 laps in single file does not count as racing in my opinion, and so I don't think it can count as a Grand Prix. With that in mind, let's take it back to Adelaide in 1991 for the true shortest Grand Prix in history, where racing actually took place, even if it perhaps should not have done. At the previous race, the Japanese Grand Prix, Ayrton Senna had dramatically clinched his 3rd World Championship as Nigel Mansell spun off into the gravel in pursuit, making this the 5th year in a row where a champion was crowned at Suzuka, although at least this time it was a fair contest with no deliberate crashing. I'm looking at you, Senna and Prost. Talking of Prost, he would be absent from the grid after he was fired by Ferrari for criticising the team and calling his car a truck. Basically a GP2 engine situation, but if McLaren had actually fired Alonso back in 2015. Could you imagine? Into Prost's vacant seat came Gianni Morbidelli from the Minardi team, leaving a seat open at Minardi for Roberto Moreno. Unbelievably, that was Moreno's 3rd team of the year, as he had started the season with Benetton before going to Jordan in a seat swap with Michael Schumacher before losing his seat to Alex Zanardi. Back in the day, silly season was more than just nonsense rumours, it happened right in front of you in real time. The Australian Grand Prix was, of course, the last Grand Prix of the 1991 season, and the circuit was proving more difficult than usual even in the dry practice. Patrese, Schumacher, Blundell, Hakkinen, Leto, Suzuki and Tarquini all sustained damage, and several other drivers narrowly avoided the close walls of the Adelaide street circuit. They would have no doubt dreaded the sight of the incoming rain clouds that hung over the circuit like a bad omen. McLaren looked out the front row of the grid thanks to a mega lap for Senna, which was bad news for Williams, who needed at least 12 points more than them to win the Constructors' Championship. Williams lined up 3rd and 4th ahead of the Benettons and Ferraris, then the rest of the field was a jumbled mess as usual, with the struggling Lotuses of Herbert and Hakkinen just 21st and 25th on the grid, and the failures to qualify were Suzuki, Brundle, Van der Poel, Gasho in his first race since his release from prison, Tarquini and Hattori in what would have been the last race for Coloni, a team who had failed to qualify a car for over 2 years. Yes, really. Incredibly, delaying the race was not even seriously considered, despite the appalling lack of visibility. Nowadays there's a lot of discussion about how wet should be considered too wet, especially after the death of young Delano Van Toff at Spa this year. But back in 1991, for better or for worse, the attitude was that if the track was still physically there under all of that water, then you could jolly well race on it. After all, they'd spent all that money setting up an expensive street circuit, they got the crowds there, they've got to do a race at this point, right? When the race got underway, several tons of water was immediately shot into the air as 26 high-powered F1 cars wheel-spun their way off the line. It looked for a second as if Berger was to lose 2nd place to Mansell, but in the end the McLarens maintained their 1-2 order. Meanwhile, Patrese dropped back through the order, so then the Benettons were up to 5th and 6th. Amazingly, everyone survived this first lap despite a very close call between Leto and De Cesaris. Trust me, if there's one person you don't want to trust with the rear of your car, it's Andrea. One of the real shocks of the 1991 season had been the pace of a certain Mr. Michael Schumacher, who you can see passing his teammate Piquet in the spray. Michael had already been signed for Benetton for 1992, when of course he would take his first Grand Prix victory, but his teammate Nelson Piquet had actually not had his contract renewed, making this his very last Grand Prix. How you feel about this in hindsight really depends very much on how you see Nelson as a person, of course, but despite all of his flaws, it must be said that he had a tremendous career. 3 World Championships, 23 wins, 204 starts, and even a BMW M1 Pro Car Championship. What a driver, and what an advertisement for the young Michael Schumacher, who was outperforming him. Back to the Grand Prix, look at the horrible conditions, and look at Senna sliding! Ayrton was famously a master of wet conditions, so it was no surprise that everyone else was eating his dust, or spray. He was nearly 0.8 of a second faster than Mansell in qualifying, and in the race there was just no equal. This is peak Senna at his absolute best. On the second lap of the race, Nigel Mansell began his charge and took 2nd place from Berger, who then came under pressure from Schumacher. Gerhard Berger had turned up as the winner of the last Grand Prix after Senna moved over for him in Japan, but he was reportedly sick and severely dehydrated as a result of an unknown illness. Props to him for starting this race anyway. McLaren really needed him in their fight for the Constructors' Championship, and all he really needed to do was to hang on to those points. All of a sudden, Piquet was in 4th place due to a spin from Schumacher, but Piquet spun too! That's a very fast part of the circuit, a bend which nowadays has been completely reprofiled, but Piquet quickly gathered it back up again and resumed the race without losing any places. Meanwhile, Schumacher dropped out of the top 6 and was apparently out of the race, but unfortunately the camera seems to have failed to pick it up. Now, you may have noticed just then that Mansell was significantly closer to Senna than before, and the gap was now just half a second between the two as Nigel's semi-automatic Williams approached Senna's fully manual McLaren. He got a good run onto the back straight and went side by side with Senna, but all of a sudden they had to take avoiding action as 2 wrecked cars appeared out of the spray. Those are the crashed cars of Nicola Larini and Jean Alesi, whose accident was not picked up by the cameras, but they ended up in an extremely dangerous position. Nowadays, of course, that would be an instant safety car and probably also a red flag, but back in those days there was no safety car, so appallingly the race was allowed to continue. I would like to ease your minds now and let you know that no marshals were injured during this race, but looking back now I think that's almost miraculous. Even after all these years, I hope the race directors are ashamed of themselves. And now there's a road car there too, why the heck not? Sadly, Larini's retirement would mark the last time a so-called Lambo car would race in Formula 1, as the Modena team that ran them folded before the 1992 season. Lamborghini would provide engines to Minardi and LaRousse for 92, and they famously almost paired up with McLaren in 93, but ultimately Lamborghini became Lamborghini after the 93 season. Also out of the Grand Prix by this point were Thierry Boutsen and Satoru Nakajima in his final Grand Prix. He went on to found Team Nakajima, who raced exclusively in Japan, and his son Kazuki went on to become an F1 driver, WEC champion, and 3-time Le Mans winner. I wonder why we're about to look at an innocuous video of a Minardi driving in a completely straight line. Nothing could possibly go wrong. What? Oh my god. And now look as Mansell nearly loses it in the spray, right next to a marshal standing on the wrong side of the barrier. This is ridiculous! Looks like Patrese picked up a bit of floor damage. No surprise there really. The track is absolutely covered in debris, which he presumably ran over. Worse was to come for his teammate Mansell though, as he spun dramatically in the spray and clobbered the wall, ending his race on the spot. This effectively crowned McLaren Constructors' Champions, as it elevated them to 1st and 2nd as their main rivals struggled. Berger was now 2nd with Piquet back to 3rd, and there's Michele Alboreto spinning off as well. The conditions were absolutely appalling as Gerhard Berger spun off from 2nd place, and it didn't end there as he recovered before immediately spinning off again. Piquet then went through to 2nd, with Morbidelli amazingly up to 3rd in all the chaos, and while this was all happening, Ayrton Senna was desperately waving for the race to be stopped. The red flags eventually came out, the cars pulled over on the grid, and the drivers got out. They had had enough. Now, as you might expect, what followed was a lot of heated conversation about what to do with the 1991 Australian Grand Prix.
Senna probably thinks it would be a good idea to sweep it into the sea, but since it's half under it already, that is not very likely.
The race directors did actually attempt to get the race restarted, showing a 10-minute warning board on 4 separate occasions, but every time they tried to restart the race, the drivers protested and the start was halted. Riccardo Patrese was so adamant that the race should be abandoned that he actually stormed up to race control to tell them face to face what he thought, and Ayrton Senna loudly protested as well. Eventually, the race was officially abandoned, making this the first race I've covered to end under red flag conditions. So there you see the results, which were controversially taken from the penultimate lap completed rather than the final lap, meaning that Senna won, followed by Mansell, who was reinstated to 2nd place despite his crash. You'll also notice that only half points were awarded, as the race had completed just 53 kilometres of its 306 kilometre scheduled distance, way under the 75% rule. Berger was 3rd despite spinning off, Piquet was 4th in his final Grand Prix, Patrese was 5th, and then Gianni Morbidelli scored his very first half point in Formula 1 with 6th place for Ferrari. I think it's a bit of a shame that Ferrari didn't re-sign Gianni for 1992 in all honesty. I think he'd earned that seat, but in the end Ferrari opted to ruin the career of Ivan Capelli instead. Back in Australia, the only thing left to do was to hold the podium ceremony, although without Nigel since he was still in the medical centre being checked over. What a day. Guys, before I give this race a score, I want to let you know that I have a Dailymotion account for all the videos that get taken down from my YouTube channel by the pesky FOM bots. Due to the high levels of parody, review and education my videos contain, I believe that all of them fall under fair use, but sadly this isn't always enough. On my Dailymotion, you can find the 1996 Monaco and Portuguese Grand Prix, as well as the 2008 Japanese Grand Prix, and more. I also now have a Twitch channel where I stream about once a week and would really like to grow my audience. The links to both of these accounts are in the description of this video. Thank you. I rated the Grand Prix 4 out of 10 overall, with the -2 bonus points being a result of the massively shortened distance. The race may have been highly unpredictable and very tense, but I think the blatant safety violations and the fact that it was only 25 minutes long make it a race better not repeated. I was also unsure of how to score this race's championship implications, as on one hand there were only half points awarded, but on the other hand McLaren did clinch the Constructors' Championship, so in the end I settled for 5 out of 10 on that. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Gianni Morbidelli, who was running as high up as 3rd place before the red flag came out, scoring his first half point at the track where he would also score his last points and only podium finish 4 years later. As for the Anui Trophy, I actually don't feel comfortable giving it to anyone in particular for this race, since it's hard to blame incidents on drivers when there were literally rivers of water running across the track. This race was the last Grand Prix for several entrants on the grid, such as Nelson Piquet, Satoru Nakajima, Emanuele Pirro, Alex Cathy, Team Modena, and also the Leighton House name, whose team would go back to being known as March from 1992. Drive safely guys, and I'll see you next time.